Welcome back from spring break, everybody. I'm sitting here on a staircase because in the next section of The Bad Beginning, there's a certain part that reminds me of something that happened in my life. And so it helped me make a connection between something that's happening in the book and something that happened in my life. In other words, I made a text-to-self connection. So I'm going to be reading the book, and I want you to be looking out for what you think that section is. But let me give you a little bit of background first. When I was a child, I used to have these recurring nightmares. And the nightmare would start with me at the top of the staircase. And I'd be walking down the staircase when suddenly my movement would slow. And even though I tried to go down the staircase at a normal pace, for whatever reason, I started to be in suspended animation, or at least moving in slow motion. And then a disembodied voice, like the voice of a ghost or something like that, would tell me that I needed to get down to the bottom of the stairs or something terrible would happen to me. And I'd be trying, but I couldn't get there because I was frozen. And I'm quite sure that that disembodied voice was the thing that froze me. And it was this terrifying feeling to know that I needed to get down the stairs when at the same time I couldn't. So that's the connection that I'm making. And now I'm going to read the rest of the chapter that we started from The Bad Beginning. And I want you to be looking out for what you think reminded me of that recurring nightmare from my childhood. Let's get reading. Last time we were reading, Violet had climbed to the top of the tower to rescue Sunny, but when she got to the top, she had been discovered by the hook-handed man. Let's find out what happens next. The hook-handed man reached into a pocket of his greasy overcoat and pulled out a walkie-talkie. With some difficulty, he pressed a button and waited a moment. "Boss, it's me," he said. "Your blushing bride just climbed up here to try and rescue the biting brat." He paused as Count Olaf said something. "I don't know, with some sort of rope." "It was a grappling hook," Violet said, and tore off a sleeve of her nightgown to make a bandage for her shoulder. "I made it myself." "She says it's a grappling hook," the hook-handed man said into his walkie-talkie. "I don't know, boss." "Yes, boss. Yes, boss, of course I understand. She's yours." "Yes, boss." He pressed a button to disconnect the line and turned to face Violet. "Count Olaf is very displeased with his bride." "I'm not his bride," Violet said bitterly. "Very soon you will be," the hook-handed man said, wagging his hook the way most people would wag a finger. "In the meantime, however, I have to go fetch your brother. The three of you will be locked in this room until night falls. That way Count Olaf can be sure you will all stay out of mischief." With that, the hook-handed man stomped out of the room. Violet heard the door lock behind him, and then listened to his footsteps fading away down the stairs. She immediately went over to Sunny and put a hand on her little head. Afraid to untie or untape her sister for fear of incurring, a word which here means bringing about, Count Olaf's wrath, Violet stroked Sunny's hair and murmured that everything was all right. But of course, everything was not all right. Everything was all wrong. As the first light of morning trickled into the tower room, Violet reflected on all the awful things she and her siblings had experienced recently. Their parents had died, suddenly and horribly. Mrs. Poe had bought them ugly clothing. They had moved into Count Olaf's house and were treated terribly. Mr. Poe had refused to help them. They had discovered a fiendish plot involving marrying Violet and stealing the Baudelaire fortune. Klaus had tried to confront Olaf with knowledge he had learned in Justice Strauss's library and failed. Poor Sunny had been captured, and now Violet had tried to rescue Sunny and found herself captured as well. All in all, the Baudelaire orphans had encountered catastrophe after catastrophe, and Violet found their situation lamentably deplorable, a phrase which here means it was not at all enjoyable. The sound of footsteps coming up the stairs brought Violet out of her thoughts, and soon the hook-handed man opened the door and thrust a very tired, confused, and scared Klaus into the room. "Here's the last orphan," the hook-handed man said, "and now I must go help Count Olaf with the final preparations for tonight's performance. No monkey business, you two, or I will have to tie you up and let you dangle out the window as well." Glaring at them, he locked the door again and trumped downstairs. Klaus blinked and looked around the filthy room. He was still in his pajamas. "What has happened?" he asked Violet. "Why are we up here?" "I tried to rescue Sunny," Violet said, "using an invention of mine to climb up the tower." Klaus went over to the window and looked down at the ground. "It's so high up," he said. "You must have been terrified." "It was very scary," she admitted, "but not as scary as the thought of marrying Count Olaf." "I'm sorry your invention didn't work," Klaus said sadly. "The invention worked fine," Violet said, rubbing her sore shoulder. "I just got caught. And now we're doomed. The hook-handed man said he'll keep us here until tonight, and then it's the marvelous marriage." "Do you think you could invent something that could help us escape?" Klaus asked, looking around the room. "Maybe," Violet said. "And why don't you go through those books and papers? Perhaps there's some information that could be of use." For the next few hours, Violet and Klaus searched the room and their own minds for anything that might help them. Violet looked for objects with which she could invent something. Klaus read through Count Olaf's papers and books. From time to time they would go over to Sunny and smile at her and pat her on the head to reassure her. Occasionally, Violet and Klaus would speak to each other, but mostly they were silent, lost in their own thoughts. "If we had any kerosene," Violet said around noon, "I could make Molotov cocktails with these bottles." "What are Molotov cocktails?" Klaus asked. "They're small bombs made inside bottles," Violet explained. "We could throw them out the window and attract the attention of passersby." "But we don't have any kerosene," Klaus said mournfully. They were silent for several hours. "If we were polygamists," Klaus said, "Count Olaf's marriage plan wouldn't work." "What are polygamists?" Violet asked. "Polygamists are people who marry more than one person," Klaus explained. "In this community, polygamists are breaking the law, even if they have married in the presence of a judge, with the statement of 'I do' and the signed document in their own hand. I read it here in nuptial law." "But we're not polygamists," Violet said mournfully. They were silent for several more hours. "We could break these bottles in half," Violet said, "and use them as knives, but I'm afraid the Count Olaf's troop would overpower us." "You could say 'I don't' instead of 'I do,'" Klaus said, "but I'm afraid Count Olaf would order Sunny dropped off the tower." "I certainly would," Count Olaf said, and the children jumped. They had been so involved in their conversation that they hadn't heard him come up the stairs and open the door. He was wearing a fancy suit, and his eyebrow had been waxed so it looked shiny as his eyes. Behind him stood the hook-handed man, who smiled and waved a hook at the youngsters. "Come, orphans," Count Olaf said. "It's time for the big event. My associate here will stay behind in this room, and we will keep in constant contact through our walkie-talkies. If anything goes wrong during tonight's performance, your sister will be dropped to her death. Come along now." Violet and Klaus looked at each other, and then at Sunny, still dangling in her cage, and followed Count Olaf out the door. As Klaus walked down the tower stairs, he felt a heavy sinking in his heart as all hope left him. There truly seemed to be no way out of their predicament. Violet was feeling the same way until she reached out with her right hand to grasp the banister for balance. She looked at her right hand for a second and began to think. All the way down the stairs and out the door and the short walk down the block to the theater, Violet thought and thought and thought, harder than she had in her entire life. Wow, that's a really suspenseful way to end that chapter. I can't wait to find out what happens next. Did anyone have an idea about what helped me make a connection between what I was reading and my own life? What helped me make that text-to-self connection? Yes, it was the part at the end of the section when Klaus and Violet and Sunny and Count Olaf are all walking down the staircase together, and the children have a sense of dread or foreboding, It's the same kind of sense of dread or foreboding that I used to have when I had my recurring nightmares about walking down the staircase. Well, that was my connection, so what do you think I'm going to ask you? Yes, I'm going to be asking you to make your own connections. And remember, there are 3 types of connections you can make. Text-to-text connections, text-to-self connections, and text-to-world. Let's have a brief reminder about what those are. The first one that you can choose is text-to-text connections, and that's when you make a connection between what you're reading now and some other text that you've read in the past. However, in this case, it doesn't just need to be another book that you've read. It can also be a movie that you've seen, or a play that you've watched, or a painting that you've looked at. I'm being quite broad in terms of what I consider a text for text-to-text connections. Second one is text-to-self connections. And with text-to-self connections, you're making a connection between something that you are reading in a text and something that happened in your own life. And so I gave you an example of that when I was talking about my staircase nightmares. And finally, there's text-to-world connections. And this is when you make a connection between something that's happening in the text that you're reading and something else that's going on in the wider world. So it can be something you read in the news or something that you've seen going on outside your house. So, during your 30 minutes of independent reading, I want you to be looking for a connection that you can make. And in the assignment, I want you to write what the connection is and why you made that connection. What is it that reminds you of the text that you're reading? Happy reading and happy connecting.